You won't believe what happened to me, so please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I never thought I'd be sitting here at 60 years old, wondering if my own daughter was trying to have me declared incompetent. But that's exactly where I found myself last Tuesday morning, when I opened an official-looking envelope that the pattern snapped into place. My name is Eleanor Porter. I'm 60 years old, and until last week, I thought I had a pretty good relationship with my family. I live in the same neighborhood where I raised my children, in a comfortable 2-story house that my late husband and I bought 30 years ago. My garden is my pride and joy. I volunteer at the local food bank twice a week, and I manage my own finances just fine, thank you very much. Or at least, I thought everyone knew that. The letter was from Patterson, Mills and Associates, a law firm downtown that I'd never heard of. As I read through the legal jargon, my coffee grew cold in my hands. My daughter Jessica Porter Williams, 34 years old, and apparently convinced that I was losing my mental faculties, had consulted with an attorney about obtaining power of attorney over my affairs. The letter wasn't addressed to me directly, but somehow a copy had ended up in my mailbox. Later, I'd discover exactly how that happened, and it would shock me even more than the original betrayal. I must have read that letter 5 times before the words really sank in. Jessica, my firstborn, the daughter I'd supported through college and graduate school, who I'd helped with her down payment just 3 years ago, thought I was incompetent to handle my own life. The letter outlined concerns about my recent erratic behavior and questionable financial decisions. I sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the same furniture I'd been using for 15 years, looking out at the garden I'd maintained perfectly for decades, wondering what alternate reality my daughter was living in. My hands were actually shaking when I called my son David. David Porter is my youngest at 29, and he's always been the peacekeeper in our family. He works as a project manager for a construction company and lives about 20 minutes away with his girlfriend. When he answered the phone, I could hear the concern in his voice immediately. "Mom? You sound upset. What's wrong?" "David, I need you to come over here right now. Something's happened with Jessica, and I don't understand what's going on." Within 30 minutes, David was sitting at my kitchen table, reading the letter with the same bewildered expression I must have had. He kept shaking his head and running his fingers through his dark hair, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was trying to process something difficult. "This doesn't make any sense, Mom. You're sharper than half the people I work with. Your finances are in better shape than mine. What could Jessica possibly be thinking?" That's when I decided to call my best friend, Margaret Chen. Margaret and I have been friends for over 20 years, ever since we met in a book club that we still attend every month. She's a retired nurse, practical as they come, and she's never been one to sugarcoat anything. If anyone could help me figure out what was really going on, it would be Margaret. "Eleanor, I'm coming over right now," Margaret said as soon as I explained the situation. "Don't do anything until I get there. Don't call Jessica. Don't call any lawyers. Just wait for me." When Margaret arrived, she took one look at the letter and immediately started asking questions that hadn't even occurred to me. "When's the last time you talked to Jessica? Has she seemed different lately? Have you had any arguments about money or your living situation?" That's when the pieces started falling into place. Over the past few months, Jessica had been making subtle comments about the house being too big for me, about whether I should really be driving at night anymore, about how I seemed forgetful during our phone conversations. At the time, I'd brushed off her concerns as normal worry from a caring daughter. Now I was seeing them in an entirely different light. "She's been building a case," Margaret said grimly. "The question is why?" David was pacing around my kitchen by this point, getting more agitated by the minute. I can't believe Jessica would do this behind your back. If she had concerns, why didn't she talk to me? Why didn't she talk to you directly, Mom? I spent the rest of that afternoon going through my recent interactions with Jessica, trying to understand how I'd missed the signs that she was planning something like this. Every phone call, every visit, every seemingly innocent question about my daily routine took on a sinister new meaning. Had she really been evaluating my mental competence this whole time? Margaret helped me organize all my financial documents, just to prove to myself that everything was in perfect order. My bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, medical records, everything was meticulously organized and completely current. There was absolutely no evidence of the questionable financial decisions that the lawyer's letter had mentioned. Eleanor, you need to find out exactly what Jessica told this attorney, Margaret said as we finished going through the paperwork. Because either she's gotten some very wrong information about your situation, or there's something else going on here that we don't understand yet. That evening, David stayed for dinner, and we spent hours trying to figure out our next move. Should I confront Jessica directly? Should I contact the law firm? Should I get my own attorney? The whole situation felt surreal. Just that morning, my biggest worry had been whether to plant tulips or daffodils in my front flower bed. Now, I was wondering if my own daughter was trying to take control of my life. Mom, I think there's something you should know, David said as we were cleaning up the dinner dishes. Jessica called me about 3 weeks ago, asking some weird questions about you. She wanted to know if I'd noticed you seeming confused or forgetful. She asked if you'd mentioned any unusual purchases or financial decisions. At the time, I told her you seemed exactly the same as always, but now I'm wondering if she was fishing for information to support this power of attorney thing. The betrayal hit me all over again. Not only had Jessica been evaluating me without my knowledge, but she'd been trying to get David to provide ammunition for her case. The fact that my son had defended me should have been comforting, but instead, I felt hurt that this conversation had happened at all, without anyone telling me about it. But what I discovered next made the pattern snap into place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying David's revelation about Jessica's phone call, feeling more confused and hurt with each passing hour. Around 2 a.m, I finally gave up on rest and went to my kitchen to make some chamomile tea. As I was waiting for the water to boil, I remembered something that made my blood run cold. About a month ago, Jessica had insisted on taking me to lunch at that new bistro downtown. During our meal, she'd asked me about my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had recently been moved to assisted living by her family. At the time, I thought Jessica was just making conversation. But now, I remembered how she'd probed about whether I thought Mrs. Patterson's children had made the right decision. Don't you think it's better to be safe than sorry when it comes to elderly parents living alone? Jessica had asked, stirring her soup thoughtfully. I mean, what if something happened and no one was there to help? I had brushed off the comment then, but now it felt like she'd been testing the waters, seeing how I'd react to the idea of losing my independence. The more I thought about it, the more calculated that entire lunch conversation seemed. The next morning, Margaret arrived at my door at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a thermos of coffee and a determined expression. I've been thinking about this all night, Eleanor, she said, settling into my kitchen chair. Something doesn't add up. Jessica has always been protective of you, yes, but she's never been manipulative or sneaky. This whole power of attorney business feels completely out of character for her. I poured myself a cup from Margaret's thermos and sat down across from her. Maybe I don't know my daughter as well as I thought I did. Or maybe someone's been filling her head with ideas, Margaret said pointedly. Think about it. Who has Jessica been spending time with lately? Has she mentioned anyone new in her life who might be influencing her thinking? Before I could answer, David knocked on my back door and let himself in, looking like he hadn't slept much either. "Mom, I need to tell you something else," he said without preamble. "After dinner last night, I kept thinking about that phone call from Jessica. There was something she said that I didn't mention before because it seemed unimportant at the time, but now I think it might matter." Margaret and I both looked at him expectantly. "She asked me specifically about your driving," David continued, running his hands through his hair. "She wanted to know if I'd noticed you driving more slowly or seeming uncertain behind the wheel. She also asked if you'd mentioned any close calls or fender benders. When I told her you were still the best driver I know, she seemed almost disappointed." The pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. Jessica hadn't just been casually concerned about my well-being. She'd been systematically building a case against my competency, looking for evidence of decline that simply didn't exist. "There's something else," I said slowly, sharing my middle-of-the-night revelation about our lunch conversation. She was practically coaching me to agree that adult children should take control when their parents get older. Margaret set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Eleanor, I think you need to call Jessica today and ask her directly what's going on. No more guessing, no more analyzing. Just get her over here and demand some answers." David nodded in agreement. "Mom's right. This has gone on long enough. Jessica owes you an explanation, and she owes you the courtesy of discussing her concerns face to face instead of going behind your back to lawyers." I felt a surge of gratitude for both of them, but also a deep sadness that I needed their support to confront my own daughter. When had my relationship with Jessica become so complicated that I was afraid to have an honest conversation with her? "Okay," I said, reaching for my phone. "I'll call her now and ask her to come over this afternoon. But I want both of you here when she arrives. If she's been building some kind of case against me, I want witnesses to whatever she has to say." Margaret squeezed my hand encouragingly. "We'll be right here with you." I dialed Jessica's number, my heart pounding as it rang. When she answered, her voice sounded strangely cautious. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" Even that simple greeting felt loaded with hidden meaning now. Was she asking about my physical health, my mental state, or fishing for something she could use against me? "I'm fine, Jessica. I need you to come over this afternoon. We need to talk about something important." There was a long pause. "What do you want to talk about?" "I think you know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you be here at 2:00? Another pause. "Mom, if this is about what I think it's about, maybe we should wait until tomorrow. I could bring someone with me to help explain things better." The way she said "bring someone" made my stomach drop. Who exactly was she planning to bring? The lawyer? A doctor? Some kind of social worker? But what Jessica told me next revealed the shocking truth about who was really behind this entire situation. "No, Jessica," I said firmly, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "We're doing this today, and we're doing it now. 2:00. Just you." I hung up before she could argue further, my hands trembling slightly as I set the phone down. Margaret looked at me with a mixture of pride and concern. How did she sound? "Guilty," I said, without hesitation. And like she was trying to control the conversation before it even started. "Did you hear what she said about bringing someone to help explain things better? What exactly needs explaining that she can't do herself?" David stood up and began pacing around my living room, his jaw tight with anger. "This is unbelievable. She's treating you like you're already incompetent, like you can't handle a simple conversation with your own daughter." The next few hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret insisted on making lunch, though none of us had much appetite. David kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath about Jessica's behavior. I found myself second-guessing every small thing I did, wondering if this was how Jessica saw me now, as someone who needed to be managed and controlled. At exactly 2:00, Jessica's car pulled into my driveway. Through the window, I watched her sit in the driver's seat for several long minutes, apparently steeling herself for what was coming. When she finally walked to the front door, her usual confident stride seemed forced. I opened the door before she could knock. "Hello, Jessica." She looked past me to where Margaret and David were sitting in the living room, and her expression immediately hardened. "I didn't realize you were having a family meeting." "We are now," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Please, sit down." Jessica remained standing, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. "Mom, I really think this conversation would be better if we could have some privacy. There are things we need to discuss that are just between us." "No," I said, moving to stand beside Margaret's chair. "These people care about me, and they've been here for me when I needed support. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of them." For a moment, Jessica looked genuinely hurt, and I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the lawyer's business card, the carefully probing questions, the systematic way she'd been documenting my supposed decline. David leaned forward in his chair. "Jessica, we know about the lawyer. We know you've been asking around about getting power of attorney. Don't you think Mom deserves to know what's going on?" Jessica's face flushed red, but instead of the shame I expected to see, there was defiance in her eyes. "Fine. Yes, I consulted with an attorney, and yes, I've been concerned about Mom's ability to make good decisions for herself. Someone needs to be looking out for her future." "What decisions?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "What have I done that's so concerning you feel the need to take legal action against me?" "It's not legal action against you, Mom. It's legal protection for you." Jessica finally sat down, but perched on the edge of the sofa like she might bolt at any moment. "You're getting older. You live alone. You're making financial decisions without consulting anyone. What happens if something happens to you? What happens if you get sick or confused and someone takes advantage of you?" Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. "Has Eleanor shown any signs of confusion? Any signs that she can't handle her own affairs?" Jessica hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the truth. She couldn't point to anything specific because there wasn't anything specific to point to. "It's not about what's happening now," Jessica said finally. "It's about being prepared for what might happen." "The lawyer said it's much easier to establish these things before there's a crisis." "The lawyer said," David repeated, his tone dripping with disgust. "So this wasn't even your idea originally?" Jessica's composure cracked slightly. "Of course it was my idea. I'm the one who's worried about her. I'm the one who has to think about what happens when she can't take care of herself anymore." "When, not if," I said quietly. "You've already decided that I'm going to become incompetent." "Mom, that's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Jessica?" I sat down across from her, forcing myself to look directly into her eyes. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've been planning to take control of my life based on something that hasn't happened and might never happen." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of my mantel clock. Jessica stared down at her hands, and when she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "I'm scared, okay?" she said, her voice breaking. "I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared of something happening to you when I'm not here to help. I'm scared that by the time I realize you need help, it'll be too late to do anything about it. Her honesty caught me off guard, and I felt my anger soften slightly, but Margaret wasn't ready to let her off the hook. So, your solution was to go behind her back to a lawyer instead of talking to her about your concerns? Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I knew she'd react exactly like this. I knew she'd be upset and defensive. Of course I'm upset, I said. You've been treating me like I'm already incapacitated. You've been looking for evidence that I'm declining. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? But that's not what I was doing, Jessica protested, though her voice lacked conviction. David shook his head. Come on, Jessica. The questions about her driving, the comments about older people needing help with decisions, the way you've been watching her every move when you visit. If that's not building a case, what is it? Jessica was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The lawyer wasn't my idea originally. Someone else suggested I look into it. My blood ran cold. Someone else? Who? Jessica looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part guilt, part fear, part something else I couldn't identify. Mom, there's something I haven't told you about why I really started worrying about your competency. It wasn't just general concern about your age. Someone contacted me 3 weeks ago with some very specific concerns about your recent behavior. Someone who claimed they'd been watching you and had serious doubts about your mental state. The room seemed to spin around me. Someone had been watching me? Someone had contacted my daughter with concerns about my mental state? Who? I managed to ask. Who contacted you? Jessica's next words would reveal a betrayal so deep and unexpected that it would change everything I thought I knew about the people in my life. Jessica took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the coffee table. It was Robert. The name hit me like a physical blow. Robert, my neighbor of 15 years. The man who brought in my mail when I was out of town, who helped me with my gutters last spring, who I'd shared countless conversations with over the back fence. Robert Henley? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Jessica nodded miserably. He called me 3 weeks ago, said he'd been noticing things, that you'd been acting confused, forgetting conversations you'd had with him. He mentioned that you'd asked him the same question about his garden 3 times in 1 week, and that you seemed disoriented when you were getting your mail. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. My mind raced back through recent interactions with Robert. Had I repeated myself? Had I seemed confused? The more I tried to remember, the more uncertain I became about everything. Margaret leaned forward, her face flushed with anger. So a neighbor calls with gossip, and your first instinct is to hire a lawyer instead of talking to your mother? It wasn't gossip, Jessica said defensively. Robert was genuinely concerned. He said he'd been debating whether to call me for weeks because he didn't want to interfere, but he was worried about Mom's safety. David shook his head slowly. Jessica, do you hear yourself? You took the word of someone who sees Mom maybe once or twice a week over your own observations. When was the last time you spent more than a few hours with her? The question hung in the air, and I watched Jessica's face crumple as she realized she didn't have a good answer. That's exactly the problem, she said quietly. I don't see her enough to know what's normal anymore. When Robert called with specific examples, it scared me. What if I was missing signs? What if something happened to her because I wasn't paying attention? I sat back in my chair, trying to process this information. Robert had been watching me, cataloging my behavior, and had felt concerned enough to call my daughter. But as I thought about it more carefully, something didn't sit right. Jessica, what exactly did Robert tell you I said, or did? She wiped her nose with the tissue Margaret handed her. He said you asked him about his tomato plants 3 times in 1 week, each time acting like it was the first time you'd asked. He said you seemed confused about what day garbage pickup was, even though it's been the same day for years. And he mentioned that you'd been standing at your mailbox for a long time one afternoon, just staring at the mail like you couldn't figure out what to do with it. As she spoke, I felt a growing sense of unease, but not about my memory. About Robert's version of events. The tomato plants, I said slowly. I remember those conversations, but I wasn't asking the same question 3 times. The first time I asked how his plants were doing in general. The second time, I asked if he'd tried that fertilizer I'd suggested. The third time, I was asking if the fertilizer had helped, because I was thinking of using it myself. Margaret looked at me intently. Those are 3 completely different questions about the same topic. Exactly. I felt my confidence returning as the memories became clearer. And the garbage pickup? I wasn't confused about what day it was. I was asking Robert if he knew whether they'd changed the pickup time because my garbage was still sitting there at noon when it's usually collected by 10. David frowned. So you were asking about a change in schedule, not confused about what day pickup was. Right, and the mailbox incident. I paused, remembering that afternoon clearly now. I wasn't staring at the mail in confusion. I was reading a letter from the insurance company about a claim I'd filed for the roof repair after that storm last month. It was complicated, and I was trying to understand their explanation of benefits right there instead of carrying it inside. The room fell quiet as the implications of what I was saying sank in. Jessica looked stricken. But why would Robert misinterpret those things? Why would he call me if he wasn't genuinely concerned? That was the question that was bothering me too. Robert had been a good neighbor for years. Why would he suddenly start viewing my normal activities through such a negative lens? Why would he call Jessica instead of talking to me directly if he was worried? Margaret's expression had grown thoughtful and slightly troubled. There's something else we need to consider here. Robert's interpretation of these events seems awfully convenient for someone looking to build a case for incompetency. What are you saying? Jessica asked. I'm saying it's odd that someone would call your daughter with concerns instead of talking to the person directly, especially when the evidence could easily be explained by normal circumstances. Margaret looked at me carefully. Have you had any other interactions with Robert recently? Anything that might explain why he'd want to portray you as declining? I thought back over the past few months, and suddenly a memory surfaced that made my stomach drop. A conversation I'd had with Robert just a month ago, one that had ended badly and that I'd tried to put out of my mind. Oh my God, I whispered as the pieces suddenly clicked into place. I know why Robert called you, Jessica, and it has nothing to do with concern for my well-being. The memory hit me like a physical blow, and I could feel my face flushing with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. How had I pushed this conversation so far back in my mind? How had I not connected it immediately to Robert's sudden concern about my mental state? What is it, Mom? Jessica leaned forward, her voice tight with worry. I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. The conversation with Robert had been so unpleasant that I'd actively tried not to think about it, but now every detail was coming back with crystal clarity. About a month ago, Robert approached me about buying my house. I began, watching Jessica's eyes widen. He said he'd been thinking about expanding his property, maybe putting in a bigger garden or workshop area. He made what he called a generous offer, though it was about $30,000 below market value. Margaret's expression darkened. And you said no, I assume? Of course I said no. This is my home. I've lived here for 22 years. I love this neighborhood, and I have no intention of selling. I could feel my anger building as I remembered Robert's reaction. But Robert didn't take it well. He kept pushing, saying I should think about it seriously, that maintaining a house was getting to be too much for someone my age. David was shaking his head slowly. Let me guess. He suggested you might be happier in a retirement community or assisted living? Exactly. He went on and on about how much easier life would be if I didn't have to worry about yard work and home repairs. When I told him firmly that I wasn't interested, he got nasty. The memory of that conversation still stung. He said I was being stubborn and unrealistic, that I couldn't keep up with the house forever, and that I should accept reality before I was forced to. Jessica's face had gone pale. Before you were forced to? What did he mean by that? At the time, I thought he was just talking about the normal aging process, you know. The idea that eventually everyone has to make changes. I paused, feeling sick as I realized how naive I'd been. But now, looking back at his exact words, I think he was threatening me. The room fell silent except for the sound of Margaret tapping her pen against her notepad. Finally she spoke, and her voice was cold with professional anger. So a man makes an unsolicited offer on your house. You refuse. He gets hostile about your decision. And then suddenly he's calling your daughter with concerns about your mental competency. She looked directly at Jessica. Does that timeline concern you at all? Jessica looked stricken. Oh my God. He seemed so genuinely worried when he called. He said he'd been noticing things for weeks and finally felt he had to reach out because he cared about Mom's well-being. What exactly did he say when he called you? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Jessica closed her eyes, clearly trying to remember the conversation, word for word. He said he'd been watching you struggle with simple tasks, that you seemed confused and forgetful. He mentioned the garbage and the mail and the fertilizer questions. He said he was worried you might hurt yourself or forget to turn off the stove or something like that. Did he suggest any specific course of action? Margaret asked. He said I should consider getting power of attorney so I could help you make better decisions about your care. He even mentioned that your house was probably too much for you to handle and that I should think about helping you find somewhere more appropriate to live. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Robert hadn't just misinterpreted innocent activities. He'd deliberately twisted them to support a narrative that would pressure me into selling my house. And he'd been clever about it, approaching Jessica instead of me, presenting himself as a concerned neighbor rather than a frustrated potential buyer. David was looking furious. This is unbelievable. He basically tried to manipulate Jessica into questioning your competency so she'd pressure you to sell. But why would he think that would work? Jessica asked, though she looked like she already knew the answer and didn't like it. Because it almost did work, I said quietly. You were ready to file for power of attorney based on his word alone. If I hadn't insisted on this meeting, if Margaret hadn't asked the right questions, you might have succeeded. And once you had legal control over my decisions, you'd have been forced to sell the house whether you wanted to or not. Margaret finished grimly. Jessica buried her face in her hands. I can't believe I almost fell for this. I can't believe I almost betrayed you like that. Despite everything, my heart went out to her. Honey, you thought you were protecting me. Robert was very convincing, and he knew exactly which buttons to push. He made it seem like caring for me meant taking control away from me. But I should have talked to you first. I should have asked for your side of the story before I did anything. Jessica looked up at me with tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was so scared of losing you. of something happening to you, that I was ready to take away the very things that make you who you are. Margaret cleared her throat gently. The question now is what we do about Robert's manipulation. This goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. He deliberately provided false information to try to compromise your legal autonomy for his own financial benefit. I felt a surge of determination that surprised me with its intensity. Robert had tried to steal my independence, my home, my relationship with my daughter. He'd nearly succeeded in convincing Jessica that love meant control, that protecting me required diminishing me. I know exactly what we're going to do about Robert, I said, and even I was surprised by the steel in my voice. But first, I need to know something, Jessica. Are you absolutely certain now that I'm competent to make my own decisions? Jessica nodded emphatically. Yes. God, yes. I'm so sorry I ever doubted you. Good. Because I'm going to need your support for what comes next. I looked around at the 3 people who had become my allies in this fight. Robert thinks he can manipulate my family against me and steal my home through deception and intimidation. He's about to learn just how wrong he is. Margaret was already reaching for her phone. What did you have in mind? I want to know what legal options we have. And then, I smiled grimly, I think it's time Robert and I had another conversation about my house. Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. We have several options, and they're all stronger than Robert probably realizes. First, what he did could constitute elder abuse through financial exploitation. He deliberately provided false information to manipulate Jessica into filing legal documents that would have given her control over your assets. I felt Jessica flinch beside me at those words. The weight of how close we'd come to disaster was still settling over both of us. There's also the issue of harassment, Margaret continued. His repeated unwanted contact, showing up at your house uninvited, and his attempts to pressure you into selling constitute a pattern of behavior that crosses legal lines. Dr. Williams had been quietly observing our conversation, but now she spoke up. From a medical perspective, what concerns me most is how he tried to weaponize Jessica's natural worry about your well-being. That kind of manipulation can cause lasting damage to family relationships. Jessica's voice was small when she spoke. It almost did. Mom, I was so convinced that I was failing you as a daughter. Robert kept saying that if I really loved you, I'd make sure you were safe, even if it meant making decisions for you. She paused, wiping her eyes. He made it sound like letting you stay independent was selfish on my part. The pain in my daughter's voice broke my heart. I reached over and took her hand. Honey, that's exactly what manipulators do. They take our deepest fears and use them against us. Your fear wasn't that I'd get hurt. It was that you'd failed to protect me. He exploited that. But I should have seen through it, Jessica said. I should have trusted you more than I trusted him. Margaret was taking notes as we talked. This is actually important for our case. Jessica, would you be willing to document exactly what Robert told you and how he presented the situation, his specific words and tactics? Jessica nodded immediately. Yes, absolutely. I remember most of our conversations pretty clearly because they upset me so much. I squeezed Jessica's hand. What upset you about them? I mean, besides the obvious. He kept pushing me to act quickly, Jessica said, her voice growing stronger as she talked through it. Every time we spoke, he'd say things like, "Every day you wait puts your mother at more risk," or, "What if something happens tonight and you hadn't protected her?" He made it seem like any delay on my part was dangerous negligence. Dr. Williams nodded knowingly. That's a classic pressure tactic. create artificial urgency to prevent the target from thinking clearly or seeking other opinions. And he kept emphasizing how much money the house was worth. Jessica continued. He'd say things like, "That's a lot of equity just sitting there while your mother struggles with daily tasks." He made it sound like the house was somehow a burden instead of an asset. I felt my anger rising again, but it was a cleaner anger now, focused and purposeful rather than helpless. He tried the same approach with me, but in reverse. He'd talk about how much you worried, how much stress I was causing you by being stubborn about staying in my home. Margaret looked up from her notes. So, he was playing both sides, telling each of you that the other was suffering because of the current situation, and that his solution was the only way to help. Exactly, I said. And the brilliant part, from his perspective, was that his solution happened to put a significant commission in his pocket. Jessica shook her head in disgust. I can't believe I didn't see that angle. I was so focused on the emotional manipulation that I completely missed the financial motive. Don't blame yourself for that, Dr. Williams said gently. When we're worried about someone we love, we're not thinking about ulterior motives. We're thinking about solutions. Margaret closed her notebook and looked at me directly. So, what's your goal here? Do you want to file a formal complaint? Pursue legal action? Or handle this more informally? I considered the question carefully. Part of me wanted to make Robert pay for what he'd put Jessica and me through. But another part of me just wanted him out of our lives permanently. I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else, I said finally. And I want him to understand that there are consequences for trying to manipulate families. What if we start with a formal complaint to his real estate board? Margaret suggested. That creates an official record of his behavior, and it could result in professional sanctions. Jessica looked hopeful for the first time since we'd started this conversation. Would that actually stop him from bothering you? It would certainly make him think twice, Margaret said. Especially if we also send him a cease and desist letter making it clear that any further contact will result in harassment charges. I felt a sense of resolution settling over me. Let's do both. But first, I want to call him myself. All three women looked at me with concern. Mom, is that wise? Jessica asked. What if he tries to manipulate you again? I smiled, and I could feel that it wasn't a particularly nice smile. Honey, he's not going to manipulate me, but I'm going to make a few things very clear to him. Margaret frowned. I'd strongly advise against direct contact. It could complicate any legal action we might take. What if you're not calling him alone? Dr. Williams suggested. What if Jessica is with you, and Margaret is here to witness the conversation? I looked around at these three women who had become my support system, my advocates, my allies. A few hours ago, one of them had been preparing to take away my independence. Now, she was offering to stand beside me as I fought for it. Would you do that? I asked Jessica. Would you help me face him? Jessica's expression was fierce with determination. Mom, after what he almost made me do to you? I wouldn't miss it for the world. Margaret sighed, but she was smiling slightly. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. I want the call recorded, and I want a very specific script of what you're going to say. I reached for my phone, feeling more powerful than I had in months. Then let's get started. It's time Robert learned that this family isn't as easy to break apart as he thought. But as I scrolled to his number, my phone rang in my hands. The caller ID made my blood run cold. It was Robert. The phone's shrill ring cut through the room like a blade, and I stared at Robert's name on the screen as if it might disappear if I looked hard enough. My hands had gone cold, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. Don't answer it, Jessica said immediately, her voice tight with protective fury. Mom, please don't answer it. But Margaret leaned forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in. Actually, this might be perfect timing. We're all here, we can record it, and we can control the conversation. Dr. Williams nodded slowly. Sometimes the best way to face a fear is when you're surrounded by support. You don't have to do this alone. The phone kept ringing, that insistent electronic chirping that seemed to grow louder with each repetition. I looked around at the three women who had become my fortress against Robert's manipulation. Jessica's face was pale but determined, her jaw set in a way that reminded me of myself at her age. Margaret had her own phone out, ready to record. Dr. Williams sat forward slightly, her presence calm and grounding. If I answer this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I want to make something clear. I'm not the same woman he's been talking to for the past few months. That woman was isolated and doubting herself. This woman has backup. Jessica reached over and squeezed my hand. We're right here, Mom. The second you want to hang up, you hang up. I took a deep breath and swiped to answer, immediately putting the call on speaker. Margaret held up her phone, recording light blinking red. Hello, Robert? Oh, there you are. His voice filled the room with that familiar mixture of warmth and condescension that had fooled me for so long. I was starting to worry when I didn't hear back from you about the house showing tomorrow. The buyers are very interested, and I really think we should strike while the iron is hot. I felt Jessica tense beside me, and I could see the anger flash across her face. This man was still trying to sell my house, even after everything that had happened. Robert, I said carefully, there isn't going to be a house showing tomorrow. In fact, there aren't going to be any more house showings. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. Still friendly, but with an edge of confusion that didn't quite ring true. I'm not sure I understand. Did something happen? You seemed so committed to this move when we talked last week. What happened? I said, looking directly at Jessica as I spoke. Is that my daughter and I had a conversation. A real conversation, without anyone else influencing what we said to each other. Well, of course, Robert said, and I could practically hear him recalibrating his approach. Family communication is so important. I hope Jessica was able to help you see that this transition really is in your best interest. Jessica's eyes went wide with outrage, and she started to lean toward the phone, but Dr. Williams caught her eye and shook her head gently. This was my conversation to have. Actually, Robert, what Jessica helped me see is that someone has been lying to both of us. Someone told her I was having memory problems and needed to be in assisted living. Someone told her I was making dangerous decisions and couldn't be trusted to manage my own affairs. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Robert finally spoke, his voice had lost all its artificial warmth. I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I was only trying to help facilitate what seemed like a necessary family discussion. By telling my daughter I had dementia? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I felt a surge of power at finally saying them out loud. By convincing her that I needed a legal guardian? By making her believe that I was so mentally incompetent that she needed to take control of my finances and my medical decisions? Margaret was nodding approvingly, making notes on a legal pad. Dr. Williams leaned back slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Now, I never said anything about dementia, Robert said, and his voice had taken on a defensive edge. I simply expressed some concerns about certain behaviors I'd observed. As someone who works with elderly clients regularly, I felt it was my responsibility to... Your responsibility? I interrupted, and I could feel years of being talked over and dismissed fueling my voice. Your responsibility was to help me sell my house, if and when I decided to sell it. Your responsibility was not to diagnose me with medical conditions you're not qualified to identify. Your responsibility was not to manipulate my daughter into taking legal action against me. Jessica was gripping my hand so tightly now that I could feel her pulse through her fingertips. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were tears of pride, not sadness. "I think you're overreacting," Robert said, and there it was, the patronizing tone that had made me doubt myself for months. "Perhaps we should table this discussion until you've had some time to think more clearly about your situation." The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. I looked at Jessica, whose mouth had fallen open in disbelief. I looked at Margaret, whose pen had stopped moving across her legal pad. I looked at Dr. Williams, who was shaking her head slowly. "Did you just tell me that I'm not thinking clearly?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "I'm simply suggesting that big decisions like this shouldn't be made in the heat of emotion," Robert said, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was digging himself deeper with every word. "Why don't I come over so we can discuss this face to face? Sometimes these things are easier to work through in person?" "No." The word came out with such force that all three women in the room looked at me with surprise. "You will not come to my house. You will not call me again. You will not contact my daughter. You will remove my house from any listings, cancel any showings, and consider our professional relationship terminated. Now, let's not be hasty," Robert said, and I could hear him shifting back into sales mode. "I understand you're upset, but I really do have your best interests at heart. These buyers are serious, and the market won't stay this favorable forever. If you wait too long, you might find yourself stuck in a house you can't afford to maintain, with no family support system to help you when things get difficult." Jessica made a sound that was half gasp, half growl. Margaret's eyebrows had climbed so high they were practically in her hairline. But it was Dr. Williams who spoke, her voice cutting clearly across the speaker. "Mr. Robert, this is Dr. Williams. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and I've been listening to this conversation with great interest." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Dr. Williams," Robert finally managed, his voice noticeably higher than it had been moments before. I didn't realize there was a medical professional on the call." "Yes, well, there is," Dr. Williams replied crisply. "And I have to say, your approach to this situation has been deeply concerning from a professional standpoint. You've made several statements that suggest you believe this woman is cognitively impaired, yet you have no medical training to make such assessments." I could practically hear Robert scrambling on the other end of the line. "I never said she was impaired. I simply noticed some signs that concern me as someone who works with seniors regularly." "What signs?" Dr. Williams asked, her tone sharp and clinical. "Please be specific." The pause stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Well, she seemed confused about some of the paperwork details, and she asked me to repeat things several times. She also seemed emotional about the sale, which isn't always rational when it comes to real estate decisions." Jessica squeezed my hand again, and I could see the anger building in her eyes. Margaret was taking notes furiously, her pen moving across the page with quick, aggressive strokes. "Let me understand this correctly," Dr. Williams said, her voice deadly calm. "You interpreted normal questions about complex legal documents as confusion? You saw a client asking for clarification as a sign of cognitive decline? And you viewed emotional attachment to a family home as irrational behavior. When you put it that way, It sounds like ageism. Dr. Williams cut him off. It sounds like you made assumptions about an older woman's mental capacity based on stereotypes rather than facts. And then, rather than addressing your concerns directly with your client, you contacted her daughter and planted seeds of doubt about her mother's competency. I felt something shift inside me as I listened to Dr. Williams systematically dismantle Robert's justifications. For months, I had been questioning myself, wondering if maybe I really was losing my edge, if perhaps everyone else could see something I couldn't. But hearing it laid out this way, I realized how manipulative the whole situation had been. "That's not what happened," Robert protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I was genuinely concerned about her well-being. "Were you?" Dr. Williams asked. "Or were you frustrated that your client wasn't moving at the pace you preferred? Were you perhaps concerned that a lengthy sales process might affect your commission or your relationship with the buyers?" Margaret looked up from her notes and nodded approvingly at Dr. Williams. Jessica was staring at the phone with something approaching awe. "I resent the implication that this was about money," Robert said, and now I could hear real anger creeping into his voice. "I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've always put my clients' needs first." "Then why?" I said, finding my voice again. "Did you never once ask me directly if I was having any concerns about my memory or decision-making abilities? Why didn't you suggest I speak with my doctor if you were genuinely worried about my health? Why was your first instinct to go behind my back to my daughter?" Another long pause. When Robert spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that sounded almost sullen. "I thought Jessica would know better than anyone if you were having issues?" "Issues?" I repeated flatly. "What kind of issues specifically?" "Look, I don't want to get into all of this over the phone," Robert said. "Why don't we schedule a time to sit down and talk this through properly? I'm sure we can work something out." Jessica finally spoke up, her voice tight with controlled fury. "There's nothing to work out. You manipulated me into doubting my own mother's competency because she wasn't selling her house fast enough for your liking. You made me feel like I was being irresponsible by not taking legal action against her." "Jessica, I never told you to pursue power of attorney," Robert said quickly. "That was your decision. Based on concerns you planted," Jessica shot back. "You called me 3 separate times, Robert. 3 times you found reasons to mention how confused my mother seemed, how forgetful she was being, how emotional and irrational her attachment to the house was. You painted a picture of someone who wasn't capable of making her own decisions." Margaret leaned forward, her pen poised over her legal pad. "Mr. Robert, did you document any of these alleged signs of confusion or memory issues in your client files?" That's not really standard practice for real estate transactions," Robert said. "But it would be standard practice if you genuinely believed your client was experiencing cognitive decline that affected her ability to make informed decisions about her property," Margaret pressed. "Surely someone with your experience would know to document such serious concerns." I watched Margaret work and felt a surge of gratitude for her methodical, legal mind. She was building a case, piece by piece, showing the holes in Robert's story. "The point is," Robert said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "we have serious buyers who are ready to close. This is a good offer in a market that could change at any time. I really think—" "The point is," I interrupted, "that you're fired, effective immediately. I'll be sending you written confirmation of the termination of our agreement, and I expect all showings to be canceled and all marketing materials to be removed by the end of business tomorrow." "You're making a mistake," Robert said, and now the mask had completely slipped. Gone was any pretense of concern for my well-being. "This is a seller's market, but that won't last forever. You might not get another offer this good, and then where will you be? stuck in a house you can't maintain, with a daughter who's worried sick about your ability to take care of yourself. The silence that followed was electric. I could see Jessica's face cycling through shock, anger, and something that looked almost like grief. Margaret had stopped writing entirely and was staring at the phone. Dr. Williams made a small sound that might have been a sharp intake of breath, but it was Jessica who broke the silence, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you? How dare you use my love for my mother as a weapon against her?" I felt something shift in the room, a realignment of forces that had been pulling at our family for weeks. Jessica's anger wasn't directed at me anymore. It was laser-focused on Robert, and the raw fury in her voice made me sit up straighter. "You manipulated me," Jessica continued, her hands clenched into fists on the conference table. "You called me pretending to be concerned about my mother's well-being, but you were really just trying to manufacture a crisis so you could push through this sale." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Jessica's face as she processed what had just happened. I could see her replaying conversations in her mind, reassessing every interaction she'd had with Robert over the past month. "Jessica, I think you're overreacting." Robert's voice crackled through the speakerphone, but she cut him off. "No, I'm finally reacting appropriately. You preyed on my fears about my mother aging, about her living alone, about all the things that keep me awake at night, worrying. And you used those fears to convince me that she wasn't capable of making her own decisions." Margaret leaned back in her chair, a satisfied expression crossing her face. This is exactly the kind of unethical behavior that real estate licensing boards take very seriously. Manipulating family relationships for financial gain, creating false concerns about a client's mental capacity, pressuring vulnerable parties. "Now wait just a minute," Robert interrupted. "I never said anything that wasn't true. The house is old. It does need work. And at her age—" "At my age, what?" I found my voice again, stronger than it had been in weeks. "At my age, I should just roll over and let other people make decisions about my life? At my age, I should assume that everyone younger than me knows better?" The conference room felt smaller now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there when we'd started. Dr. Williams had been quiet through most of the exchange, but now she cleared her throat. "Robert, I've been listening to this conversation with great interest from a professional standpoint. What you've described, the pattern of planting seeds of doubt about someone's cognitive abilities, isolating them from their support system, creating urgency around decisions, these are classic manipulation tactics. They're particularly effective with adult children who are already anxious about their aging parents." Jessica's face crumpled slightly, and I could see the guilt washing over her again. I reached across the table and took her hand. "Honey, you were trying to protect me. I understand that now. But I need you to trust me to know what's best for my own life, even if my choices don't make sense to you." "But what if you do need help someday?" Jessica asked, her voice small. "What if there comes a time when you really can't take care of yourself or make good decisions? How will I know the difference between Robert manipulating me and legitimate concerns?" It was such an honest question, so vulnerable, that I felt my heart break a little. This was the real fear underneath everything. Not just Jessica's fear for me, but my own fear of losing my independence, of becoming a burden, of not recognizing when I truly did need help. "We'll figure it out together," I said. "But we'll figure it out based on real evidence and honest conversations, not because some real estate agent is whispering in your ear about commission deadlines." Margaret had been taking notes throughout the exchange, and now she looked up. "Robert, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." His voice had taken on a sullen quality. I want to be very clear about something. Any further contact with this family regarding the sale of the house, any attempts to show the property, any marketing materials that aren't removed immediately, all of that could be considered harassment at this point. Do you understand? The listing agreement is terminated. We have witnesses to that termination, including a licensed physician and an attorney. I strongly suggest you accept that and move on. There was a long pause, and then the sound of the line going dead. Robert had hung up without another word. The silence in the conference room felt different now. Not tense, but thoughtful. Jessica was still holding my hand, and I could feel some of the rigidity leaving her shoulders. I'm sorry, Mom, she said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm sorry I let him get in my head like that. You don't need to apologize for caring about me, I said. But we need to talk about boundaries, about what it means to support someone without taking over their life. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of conversation that can strengthen your relationship rather than strain it. The fact that you're both willing to have it says a lot about your family. Margaret closed her legal pad and looked at both of us. So what happens now? With the house? With the power of attorney petition? With everything? Jessica took a shaky breath. I'm withdrawing the petition, obviously. And Mom, I want to help you interview new real estate agents when you're ready. If you're ready. But it has to be your decision, on your timeline. I squeezed her hand. I'd like that. But first, I think we need to spend some time just being mother and daughter again. No lawyers, no real estate agents, no legal documents. Just us, figuring out how to navigate this new phase of our lives together. It sounded simple, but as we gathered our things and prepared to leave Margaret's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just at the beginning of a much larger conversation about aging, independence, and family. The immediate crisis was over, but the underlying questions that had made us vulnerable to Robert's manipulation in the first place, those were still waiting to be addressed. And as we walked out into the late afternoon sunlight, I realized that the hardest part might not be behind us after all. The drive home was quiet, but not the uncomfortable silence we'd endured for weeks. Jessica followed me in her car, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror, not out of worry, but out of a strange comfort in seeing her there. When we pulled into my driveway, the for sale sign was still planted firmly in the front yard, its bright red letters seeming to mock everything we'd just been through. I'll call the sign company tomorrow, Jessica said, getting out of her car and staring at it with obvious distaste. Get that thing removed. We can do it together, I said. But right now, I think we both need some tea and a chance to process everything that just happened. Inside, the house felt different somehow. Maybe it was knowing that it was truly mine again, that no one could force me out of it. Or maybe it was the relief of having my daughter back on my side instead of working against me. I put the kettle on while Jessica sat heavily at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. I keep thinking about all the things Robert said to me, she said without looking up. How he made it sound like you were in danger, like I was being a bad daughter by not stepping in. He was so convincing, Mom. So professional. I set 2 mugs on the counter and turned to face her. He was a predator, Jessica. That's what predators do. They find our vulnerabilities and exploit them. Your vulnerability was your love for me and your fear of losing me. But I almost lost you anyway. Her voice cracked slightly. I almost became the thing I was trying to protect you from. The kettle whistled, and I poured the hot water over the tea bags, using the familiar ritual to gather my thoughts. You know what Margaret told me the first day I went to see her? She said that the hardest cases weren't the ones where families didn't care about each other. They were the ones where they cared too much, in the wrong ways. Jessica finally looked up at me. What did she mean by that? I brought the mugs to the table and sat down across from her. I think she meant that love without boundaries becomes control. And control, even when it comes from love, can be just as damaging as neglect. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring into our tea. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening, a dog barking, a car door slamming, the distant hum of traffic. These were the sounds I'd grown to love over 30 years in this house, the sounds Robert had tried to convince Jessica I was too confused to appreciate anymore. I want to understand something, Jessica said finally. When did you first realize what Robert was doing? When did you know you needed help? I thought back to those early days, when Robert's suggestions had seemed so reasonable, so caring. It was gradual, I said. At first, I was flattered by the attention. Here was this successful young man telling me I was smart to sell, that I deserved to enjoy my golden years without the burden of homeownership. But then, he started calling more often, showing up without appointments. And the things he said about you, that's when I knew something was wrong. What things? He told me you were too busy with your own life to really understand what I needed. That you'd be relieved if someone else took responsibility for my decisions. He was trying to isolate me from you, make me think I couldn't depend on you. Jessica's jaw tightened. And I played right into it by trying to get power of attorney. I proved his point. No, I said firmly. You proved that you love me. Robert twisted that love, used it against both of us. But the love itself, that's what saved us in the end. My phone buzzed on the counter, and we both tensed instinctively. But when I checked it, I smiled with relief. It's Margaret, I said, reading the text. She says the sign company will be out first thing tomorrow morning to remove the sign. Robert's listing has been officially terminated with the multiple listing service. Jessica let out a long breath. So it's really over. The immediate crisis is over, I corrected. But we still have work to do. We need to figure out how to move forward from here. How to rebuild the trust that got damaged in all of this. I don't know how to do that, Jessica admitted. I don't know how to stop worrying about you without trying to control everything. I reached across the table and took her hand. Maybe we start by talking to each other more. Really talking, not just the surface-level check-ins we've been doing. And maybe we establish some ground rules about what help looks like versus what taking over looks like. Like what? Like, if you're worried about something, you come to me directly instead of going to a lawyer. And if I need help with something, I ask for it specifically instead of expecting you to read my mind. Jessica nodded slowly. That sounds reasonable. But Mom, what if there comes a time when you really can't make these decisions for yourself? What if you really do need someone to step in? It was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one I knew we had to address. Then we'll face that together, with honesty and respect. With doctors who actually examine me, not lawyers who benefit from declaring me incompetent. And with the understanding that even if I need help, I'm still a person with rights and dignity. Dr. Williams said something today that stuck with me, Jessica said. She said that supporting someone's independence sometimes means accepting their right to make choices you don't agree with. That's a hard lesson for a daughter to learn, I said gently. You've spent your whole life looking out for me in one way or another. First as a child who needed me to be strong, then as an adult who wanted to give back. It's natural that you'd want to protect me now. But protection and control aren't the same thing. No, they're not. And learning the difference, That's going to be an ongoing process for both of us. We talked for another hour as the sun set outside my kitchen window. We talked about practical things, like how I wanted to handle my finances and healthcare decisions as I got older. We talked about emotional things, like Jessica's fear of losing me and my fear of becoming a burden. And we talked about the future, about what our relationship could look like if we both committed to honesty and respect. When Jessica finally got up to leave, she paused at the front door and looked back at me. "I love you, Mom, and I'm proud of you for fighting back when you had to." "I love you too," I said, "and I'm proud of you for being brave enough to admit when you were wrong." After she left, I walked through my house slowly, really seeing it for the first time in weeks. The living room where I'd hosted countless family gatherings. The kitchen where I'd taught Jessica to cook. The garden visible through the back window where I'd spent so many peaceful mornings. This was my home, my life, my choice. And tomorrow, when that sign came down, it would be official again. I thought about Robert, probably somewhere across town dealing with the reality that his scheme had fallen apart. I wondered if he'd learned anything from this experience, or if he'd just move on to his next target. I hoped that somewhere, somehow, our story might prevent another family from going through what we'd endured. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for Margaret's fierce advocacy. Grateful for Dr. Williams' wisdom and professionalism. And grateful for a daughter who loved me enough to fight for me, even when she was fighting in the wrong direction. The crisis was over, but the real work, the work of being a family, of loving each other well, that work would continue for as long as we both drew breath, and I was ready for it.